Hello, and welcome to one of the strangest postmortem analyses that I have done in this space. If you were with us yesterday, you probably saw that we put up our postmortem discussion of The Last of Us Part 2, but now, only one day later, director Neil Druckmann and I believe his lead writer, Halley Gross, have sat down with IndieWire, or more specifically have done a Zoom call with IndieWire, to go over a lot of the things that we complained about in our discussion of the narrative structure of the game yesterday. So because of that, I wanted to do another video on it. I don't really have a great space for this kind of thing, going over an interview about a piece of media that we already analyzed. So I did it as another postmortem. Hope you don't mind. If you aren't familiar with postmortems, you should probably start with the one we did yesterday. But otherwise, this is where we discuss things that we have seen, things that we have played, things that we have read already. And because this is such a rare event, because this is so unusual that a director of a major piece of pop culture would come out with very specific answers about some very good questions, actually, from IndieWire, which is otherwise trying to do this as a kind of ode to The Last of Us Part 2 and to these particular individuals, and we'll get to their introduction there in just a minute. I really did feel like this was such a rare event that we had to go over it. And if you aren't familiar with me, you will hear me say things from an analytical perspective. You will hear me say things from a very opinion-oriented perspective, and you'll find that I disagree with a lot of what is said here. If you wound up liking this game, if you just love it, if you want to come into the comments and tell me why I'm wrong about not loving it, you are more than welcome to do so as long as you're respectful. I love disagreement. Reasonable disagreement is the spice of life. I've already had some good interactions with people that have disagreed with the postmortem analysis and review that I did yesterday on The Last of Us Part 2, so please feel free to do that. But you are otherwise going to hear me be rather feisty with some of these answers because of how ridiculous I think they are. So with that as the background, let's dive in. Neil Druckmann and Halley Gross open up about the biggest twists of The Last of Us Part 2. After years of total secrecy, Neil Druckmann and Halley Gross sit down for the first extensive spoiler-filled interview about the ambitious story in modern video game history. About the most ambitious story, I believe. I'm sure that'll get corrected when this is edited later on. But yeah, I guess the other thing I should say is this will obviously be completely spoiler-filled. This is all about spoiler questions. If you are interested in not spoiling yourself about the game, get out now, and please come back later. The first 15 minutes of the video we did yesterday are absolutely available, and you can check it out. So, from the moment that The Last of Us Part 2 was first announced in 2014, its plot has been one of gaming's most closely guarded secrets. Now, I know it's only the first sentence of this particular article, but we do have to point out now that really we came to The Last of Us Part 2 story 6 or 8 weeks ago on the notion that Sony was DMCAing takedown notices of discussions about all of the leaks that came out of this game. And so, while I understand this as the introduction, it is wrong to suggest that this has been a closely guarded secret for at least the last couple of months. The beloved first installment of Naughty Dog's post-apocalyptic adventure series told a heart-stopping story that, while self-contained, still managed to end with a wrenching cliffhanger. Again, I know, second sentence of the article, but The Last of Us Part 1 does not end with a cliffhanger. It does end with a somewhat ambiguous scene, very similar to maybe Inception or something along those lines, although Inception might be characterized as a cliffhanger a little bit more than The Last of Us Part 1, but it ends with an ambiguity which still wraps up its story almost completely because it's entirely emotional. Nobody's in danger. Nobody's at risk. Did Joel know what he was doing at the end when he told Ellie the story that he told her? Did she believe him? And I think, for me personally, it was always a notion of she believed what she had to believe in order to feel at all comfortable about the situation. That she was smart enough to know something was up, but that she didn't want to challenge Joel in that moment, etc., etc. A lot of good people can have a lot of good discussions about that. certainly when we get to The Last of Us Part 2, as we talked about in our video yesterday, you get to a more fulsome explanation. The game and the game writer and director actually telling you that Joel was in the wrong. Ellie knew something was up. She then solidified that understanding through going through various bits of her memory and going back to the hospital. And at the end of the day, she wanted to die, and she felt that Joel was in the wrong for taking that choice away from her. Now, I do think that eliminates some of the ambiguity from The Last of Us Part 1. It eliminates some of the lyricism and some of what I loved about that game, but it was probably unavoidable in the context of a sequel, so I don't begrudge them that. I do begrudge IndieWire a discussion that this is a wrenching cliffhanger to end the first game on. Now, we get into their description of what this new game is. When a bevy of sensitive cutscenes leaked onto the internet this past April, odd that you just said that it was one of gaming's most closely guarded secrets, but that's fine, and revealed certain details about the plot. 19-year-old Ellie is the protagonist instead of Joel. She's openly gay, which was known in, I think, 2014, and one of the major characters is trans. Not, I think, revealed in the actual leaks, but I'm not sure because I never actually saw them. Certainly Abby does not appear to be transgender, so it's not really an issue there. Lev is, but I don't know what part that person played in respect to the leaked materials because I haven't seen them. It became clear that the Star Wars movie in question, because they were equating this release to Star Wars, is in fact The Last Jedi, which is just ironic on any number of levels. That comparison isn't only apt, according to IndieWire, because writer-director Neil Druckmann and co-writer narrative lead Halley Gross have triggered the most toxic pockets of their fandom by daring to make a game that actually reflects the wide spectrum of people who will play it. They've created a bold, astonishing pop masterpiece on the largest possible scale, a beautiful and fearless blockbuster sequel that honors the magic of its source material by deepening The Last of Us as opposed to just echoing what people already love about it. Wow. So we know what we're getting into with kind of the background here. Now, I will say this, okay? I understand. I am empathetic, and we're going to talk a lot about empathy when we discuss this interview. I am empathetic to the IndieWires of the world, to the journalists of the world. They basically have to do this kind of introduction if you're going to get this kind of access. And we talk a lot about access, and some people take it too far. It's not really the same as getting paid for your opinions, but it does mean, hey, we're going to give you this interview, and you're going to treat us nicely. And you say, yes, of course we are. That's why you're giving us the interview. That's why we have this access. This goes a bit far in my mind, saying or suggesting that most of the uproar, most of the people that are upset with this particular game are toxic pockets of their fandom. And certainly we've talked about The Last Jedi in this space in the past, on this channel at least, as one of the things that really got me into this space as a lawyer with a law firm was writing an article about how I felt The Last Jedi's narrative failed it. And you can see a video version of that on this channel. You can also see the link in that video to the actual article that I did, and that wound up going viral in a way that I hadn't expected, and I learned a lot about the internet and ultimately started this YouTube channel based off of it. But one of the things that I always dislike about discourse that happens on social media and Twitter and elsewhere, sometimes in the comments to my videos, but mostly not, I really enjoy talking with a lot of you in those comments, is this notion that anybody that disagrees with you, that dislikes something, must be toxic, must be bigoted, must be not empathetic, must be dumb. And that just isn't the case. You can come into my comments and tell me why you think The Last of Us Part 2 is great, and I will disagree with you in all likelihood, but I will hopefully take your perspective into account, try to understand how you arrived at that, what you like about it that maybe doesn't work for me, and hopefully learn a little bit more about how I personally feel about narrative and how someone else might view it. That's the game. That's the goal. That's living. But all too often you get this kind of introduction. You get the people on my Twitter talking to me about how I don't understand something or how I lack empathy with respect to these certain things. And one of my main criticisms is actually the structure of the game. I don't necessarily disagree with putting forth a revenge quest that has you ultimately empathize with the revenge target. I just think it was handled poorly. And is it beautiful and fearless? No. And does it actually echo what people already loved about the original? Most definitely no. Following Ellie from Wyoming to Seattle on a bloody quest to avenge her murdered father figure, The Last of Us Part 2 tells an unforgettable story about the nature of justice, the cycle of violence, and the radical empathy required to end it. Now, Neil Druckmann has used the word justice a lot in reference to this game, And I always want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I always want to give him credit. There is no justice in what happens in The Last of Us Part 2. There's very little justice in what happens in The Last of Us Part 1. But nothing in this story is about justice. Vengeance isn't justice. Vigilantism isn't justice. Going and murdering an entire city of people in either an army or a cult is not justice. And you would think that at the end of this particular story, that kind of realization would happen, but it doesn't. And as we will see in their answers, they don't actually even talk about justice in what they are talking about happens in this game. It's just something that they use as a kind of magic bit of wording, because every revenge story should be talking about these things, should be talking about justice. I do think the game talks about the cycle of violence a little bit, but not in a way that is intelligible. And then the radical empathy required to end it is suggestive of what happens with Ellie and Abby in both of their interactions. But what they do and don't do isn't radical empathy. They've already killed their target in the case of Abby, and they've already killed most of the crew in the case of Ellie, along with hundreds of cultists and army figures for both of them. That's not radical empathy. You want to talk to me about radical empathy, we should be talking about something like Pope John Paul, right? If you're not familiar with this story, this is a pope in the early 80s that got shot twice by an assassin and then went and forgave him, right? This is the kind of thing that is actually radical empathy. The Pope, to my knowledge, did not start murdering people and then decide that was bad and ultimately empathize with the person that shot him. He didn't do that, I don't think. No, this is radical empathy. The Last of Us Part 2 is not radical empathy. It's essentially getting to the end of a game and saying, we're done. Everybody go home. Credits roll. And that's not a terribly interesting story, but it's also not a very terribly interesting bit of messaging. And I would have had them pick one or the other. If you're going to be pretentious and you're going to talk to me like I'm a child, then please go all the way and actually formulate a message. But as we will see, they couldn't do that because the actual nature of this game was changing throughout its production in such a significant way that the themes and the story and the character and the motivations and the structure and everything we talked about yesterday, everything that people that are really looking at this game with a critical eye are talking about vis-a-vis the things that we don't think it did right, couldn't have been fixed because they were never really solid on what this thing was. We will see a number of answers where Druckmann and Gross disagree, or at least don't exactly align on what it is they think was happening, particularly with Ellie. And then finally, we finish IndieWire's introduction with, this is some of the most nuanced and audacious storytelling choices in video game history. To which I can only say, go out there and play more video games, IndieWire. The Last of Us Part 1, in particular, if you really love this kind of format. I think even the Uncharted's have some more cogent storytelling. Days Gone from last year, which I actually left off of my review from yesterday because I didn't really want to confuse the issue, I think actually handled a lot of these character beats, including cultists that like to scar themselves, better than what The Last of Us Part 2 actually wound up doing. And I actually do think from a business and law perspective, it is remarkable that Sony greenlit Days Gone and The Last of Us Part 2 with so many thematic similarities, so many bits of character and world building that are almost identical at the same time. I don't know what company spends hundreds of millions of dollars on those two projects at the exact same time, but Sony did, and then they wound up DMCA striking almost everybody that wanted to talk about the latter. But here's the interview. Let's talk about what they actually say, because this is fascinating. First, IndieWire says the story of The Last of Us Part 2 is almost perfectly symmetrical. Can you talk about how you wanted the two halves of the game, Ellie and Abby, to reflect each other? Well, with the first game, says Neil Druckmann, the exciting thing was role reversal. You're playing as this archetypal hero for a while, and then at a certain point we flip it and you play as Ellie. Now, before we press on, there's just already so much wrong in the first part of this sentence. Joel is not an archetypal hero. In fact, in The Last of Us Part 1, Joel is very little to have sympathy with. He is a smuggler. He is angry at almost everyone. He stays very close to the vest. And yes, you see him kind of warm throughout the game to Ellie, but he is anything but a kind of archetypal hero. He is instead the kind of anti-hero that you can otherwise empathize with, a almost Walter White figure, if you're familiar with Breaking Bad. That doesn't make him archetypal. An archetypal hero might be something like Luke Skywalker, at least prior to The Last Jedi, and other folks of that ilk, where you've got that heroicism, you've got that knightlyhood, that actual morality and desire to do good and bring peace and justice as part of your kind of core being. Joel was only ever a survivor, so he wasn't archetypal. Then Neil continues by saying, seeing how well that worked was so much of the inspiration here, and when we decided to make a game about empathy, we knew we had to double down on that feeling. So we look at this and we say, all right, so what you are saying is that the 1/2 season in winter in The Last of Us Part 1, where you got to play as Ellie, it was a bit of a surprise. You said, we're going to do that again, but bigger. I don't see that as this audacious storytelling that IndieWire wants to proclaim it as. I see it as someone saying, hey, that was fun. That was a good gimmick. Let's do that gimmick again. And I really did feel that way when I was playing the game myself. So this answer doesn't surprise me. But then we start talking about, we decided to make a game about empathy. You're already connected to Ellie and Joel from The Last of Us, so we put them through a very tragic event. Well, they put Ellie through a very tragic event. Joel's, I guess, was tragic, but when it's over for him. Give you one look at a quest for revenge, and then shift to Abby in order to tell a mirror story of redemption. Now, that's an important bit of context, right? One of the things I talked about in my earlier review video of the game was that Abby's plotline didn't actually mesh with Ellie's. You've got a simultaneity of the plot lines, the same 3 days in Seattle, but what you do as Abby doesn't really even interact with what Ellie is doing to hunt down the wolves and otherwise kill all your friends. Abby is instead on this fairly random set of side quests where she meets some kids, decides the kids aren't evil, decides she has to help the kids get some medical supplies, then ultimately run into the island of darkness in Apocalypse Now and save the one kid who has to murder his mother and then winds up losing the other kid and bringing the one kid back. And it's all fine. I mean, it's all an interesting enough story, I guess, if it were completely separated from the overall structure of The Last of Us, but it doesn't interact. And you don't get a sense that Abby is redeeming herself. You get a sense that she is trying to allay her guilt, that she feels at least somewhat bad for having done this thing in murdering Joel, and now she is trying to be a better person. And you get that kind of reiterated upon with Owen and his story and saying, hey, I couldn't kill this one particular cultist because I didn't want to be fighting anymore. And yesterday we talked about the fact that the actual subtext of that is that getting your revenge makes you a better person. That actually completing your vengeance quest makes you want to stop doing all the other evil things that you were doing, and maybe that was necessary to grow as a human being, which is a terrible message and can't possibly be the message that the game was trying to convey, and you don't see that message described here, but you do see it as redemption. We were trying to find those parallels you're talking about and to do so in a way where it's not on the nose. Literally everything in the game with respect to Abby is on the nose. Under different circumstances, they could have been friends. They're trying to accomplish that empathy. They're trying to show you that Abby is a person. And one of the things I complained about yesterday was it is a completely superficial and facile kind of statement to put forth that the murder targets of your main character are in fact people, and they had lives, and they had other things that you might otherwise consider before murdering them. And when they say they don't want to be on the nose, I would recommend to them not introducing Abby with a couple of scenes of playing fetch with the dog, saving an injured zebra so that it can be restored with its parents, having her have these loving conversations with her dad, walking through the stadium and having conversations with Manny's dad, and being a friend to orphans and mothers and injured animals everywhere. The entirety of Abby's concept is on the nose. And I don't necessarily mind that, but let's not pretend that it's any great bit of audacious storytelling. They then ask, why have players control Abby for a bit in Jackson before Joel's murder? And they say, we wanted the opportunity to build empathy for her. You're introduced to this character. She's afraid of heights. She's got some kind of romantic entanglement with Owen. They're having conversations. Yeah, I actually thought it was a good introduction to the character. She had some nice beats. As I said in my video yesterday, Naughty Dog is very good with small talk. And so even Abby talking to herself and dealing with the blizzard and the horde and talking to Owen, that was all handled well. And I didn't have a problem with it whatsoever. I had empathy with her already because she's a human being. And even if she's a human being that does this terrible thing, and I think both Ellie and Abby are people that do terrible things, you always have empathy for another human being if you grew up with any kind of moral code whatsoever. These games are famous for how they engage with the player's agency and sense of control. In Last of Us, our alignment with Joel compels us to justify his actions as he murders innocent people to protect Ellie. Wow. No, that's not right. As a matter of fact, in The Last of Us, and I'm speaking only for myself, I can't speak for everybody else on these kinds of things, one of the major issues with the ending is how much you can feel the puppet masters take control of their story. That in that moment in time, I, corporate lawyer, believer in informed consent, said this isn't right. It wasn't right what the Fireflies were doing either, but that Ellie needed to be woken up to be asked how she feels about this. And I know a number of people have come into my comments and said, well, she wasn't old enough. Well, she's 15 in Last of Us land, and I think that's probably age of majority for whatever the likely lifespan of a Last of Us person is. But even disregarding that, then you might have to wait a year or 3. Either way, it wasn't Joel's decision to make, and certainly not as definitively as killing everyone in the hospital. A number of other comments brought up the fact that you can't actually sneak through the hospital after killing the head surgeon. That's fine. I don't do it that way. I don't think the game really leads you up to that way, but if you do it that way, that's great. You still had to murder the surgeon, and you didn't have any choice in the matter. And so this question is good. I don't agree with the kind of premise. It says, hey, you do have this bifurcation of what you want to accomplish as a player and what you do, but when we fight Abby, Ellie chooses to spare her life. When we fight Ellie, Abby chooses to spare her life. So you're taking away all these choices. You're not necessarily explaining them that well. Answer for yourself, Director Druckmann. And he says, I think the ending of The Last of Us worked for a lot of people because of how in the beginning of the game, we did a lot to put you in alignment with Joel and to make you care for Ellie. And because we delayed Joel making the choice to take care of Ellie for a while, people like Tess keep making that choice for him. We knew that some people were not going to be on board with Joel's decision at the end of the game. Right. I would hope that that would be most people. And interestingly, The Last of Us Part 2 actually says, yes, that it was wrong. You took that choice away from Ellie. So it's interesting that he frames it as the some people, almost indicating that they hoped or thought that most people would be on his side. He continues by saying, we tried to make it so that even if you're not in alignment with him by the time you got there, we have hinted at what he's capable of so much that you're still on board for the ride. That's all well and good. I don't have a problem with you telling the story of Joel. I play JRPGs. I love them. And those are stories of another. I don't have choice in that matter. I get to enjoy that story for what it is. But there is no agency there. And then he continues by saying there's something interesting that happens when you're not in alignment with the character, and the game makes you do something that you don't want to do. There is something interesting. You have that complete separation. Whatever was a kind of avatar-like relationship between this person that you are controlling with your joystick ceases, and you are simply playing out what amounts to a visual novel with action elements. He describes it differently, though. He says you wrestle with those decisions in a different way than you would be able to in a passive medium. Yeah, I think you can watch bad people do bad things and feel a little bit differently about it than you actually having to do those things. But I can't speak for everyone. I know that in my specific instances, I always resent it. I always look at it and say, you're making me do this thing. I want to see the next cutscene. I want to see where this story goes. But I'm not on board with this, and that's fine. I don't have to be on board with everything you tell me, everything you deign to show me in this story. But we should make note of the fact that I'm not on board. I'm not wrestling with it. It's not up to me. What happens to me is I have a complete separation. Oh, right. This isn't my story. This is your story. Go nuts. I don't wrestle with it. I just think, okay, you're telling a different story. That's up to you. I would have done things differently. IndieWire continues by saying many players and most parents might have understood Joel's decision, but Ellie herself is struggling to make sense of it, and it doesn't seem like she gets all the way there until after the fight with Abby in Santa Barbara, the very last fight where she ultimately doesn't kill Abby. And Druckmann says correctly, Joel has made this decision for Ellie, and now she has to deal with the consequences of that choice that was made for her. Then he does something where he backs off, right? Oh, that sounded like a little bit too much of a passionate statement. I'm not putting any judgment on it because we do what we feel is right. Now, I think you can put judgment on it one way or the other. I would hope that the director and the writer puts judgment on it one way or the other. Yeah, you're telling a story, but you are completely in charge of what that story is. So I would hope it's not just, hey, he's just a guy. He came to me in a dream and this is what he did. And I said, all right, my man. And for Joel, the decision to choose Ellie over the vaccine was pretty consistent with his character. I think that's all correct. But note a couple of things here, right? The actual question, if it is at all a question, it's kind of a statement, is that Ellie doesn't get there until Santa Barbara, and all he does is talk about Joel's actions with respect to Ellie in The Last of Us Part 1. This is a thing that you will see Neil Druckmann do a couple of places in this interview. When he is asked anything about the actual motivations of the characters, he tends to elide giving an actual answer and talking about something else that he wants to talk about. So here, even though it's not a question so much from IndieWire, they are trying to get him to talk about what made Ellie make sense of it in Santa Barbara, what led her there, what her thought process was before that. And IndieWire will return to that and get a slightly better answer from Druckmann. But note that he's avoiding the question. He doesn't want to talk about that. He says, oh yeah, we've talked about The Last of Us Part 1. Remember when that thing happened at that hospital? That was a pretty cool moment. Everybody loves that. Let's talk about that again. The game's biggest plot twist is a subtle tweak in perspective as we learn that Ellie has known the truth of what Joel did the whole time and chose to seek revenge against his killers anyway. That information drives a deeper wedge between Ellie and the player. I don't know that it does, but that's the very last cutscene of the game, so it's hard to see how there is, in fact, a deeper wedge between Ellie and the player. Gross, the writer, says Ellie's got survivor's guilt, PTSD, and is haunted by what she has lost. Totally fine. She's haunted by what Abby took away from her, and also we come to realize she's haunted by what happened to her relationship with Joel after he told her the truth, and she was so hurt by it. Now, I don't get that feeling from the game, and that might be on me. Hey, writers can put things in that people can miss, that gamers can miss, that readers can miss, that viewers can miss. That's fine. I don't think if that was what they were trying to show, they actually accomplished that. She continues by saying, by piecing those details out, it allows us to be with this internal character who isn't much of a sharer, and it allows us to feel those memories coming back to her as she progresses through the narrative. Now, if you haven't played the game and you are watching these because you're interested in my thoughts and don't otherwise care about playing the game, it's worthwhile to note here that what happens is you have these scenes in the video game where you are in present day, and then they cut to black and they open back up with some kind of flashback. They do this, I don't know, maybe 10 times at various stages of both Ellie's and Abby's history, and they just happen. And there are conceits that you get in narrative, especially visual narratives like TV and movies and now video games in terms of cinematic gameplay, that can establish that what you are seeing in a flashback is what the character is reflecting on. Sometimes you just have them pause and you go to the other scene and they come back and it's like, oh yeah, they're thinking about this and they're reflecting on it. You get a lot of this in fantasy sequences and shows like Scrubs, where you can actually show that this is what the character is thinking about. That doesn't happen here. The language of cinema, of visual media, doesn't suggest that what you are being told in flashback form is something that the character is reliving. And it appears that that was the goal from this answer and in another couple of places in this interview. And I do think they failed at that. They didn't actually establish that apparently when Abby is thinking about X, she's reflecting on that time she went on a date with Owen. Or when Ellie is thinking about Y, she's reflecting on that time she went to the museum with Joel. And to be honest, it doesn't make a lot of sense where they're positioned to have that happen anyway. And we'll also get to that because, again, they were kind of figuring this thing out. It also progressively contextualizes what's driving her. At first you think it's just screw these people, they killed my father figure, but then you realize, well, how much does she feel culpable in this? How much does she feel like that she took something away from Joel? Again, I don't get that. I get a lot of conversations, I get additional context, very kind of Lostian. You're getting this background that you should have had to begin with, but it creates a little bit of mystery as to what's going on, and so they kind of tease it out. But you don't get that kind of association with what Ellie is going through, what Abby is going through. And if that was the goal, they failed. Druckmann then says, hey, there was a functional reason for those flashbacks too. Absolutely there was. If you're going to kill Joel in the first 2 hours and everybody loves Joel, well, we want to show you Joel later on in the game. And that's basically what he says here. Gross says the whole game is about consequences of choices that we make, and to do flashbacks that didn't unpack those consequences, that would have been doing a disservice to our theme. Druckmann says, I remember the fear of how much people love the ending of the first game because of how ambiguous it is. For years, people have been debating all the things we already talked about, and as it turns out, it's all of those things. We wanted with each flashback to show that at first Ellie's in denial about it, and then it's this thing that's hanging over her relationship. Then she's starting to suspect, she figures it out, it blows up, and then the very last thing they wind up showing you is that it's gone, or at least that she was willing to try to start forgiving. Each step of the way, we wanted you to think that Ellie's relationship with Joel ended on a different note. Here again, and this might be my problem and not yours, I believe they utterly failed. They did a bit of foreshadowing, which was a big red flag, a big hat on a lamppost to me. At the very start of the game, you get a notion that Ellie is reflecting on the last conversation she had with Joel. And a couple of things happen then. One, I said, that'll probably be, after he's murdered, that'll probably be the last conversation, or very close to the end of the game, to reestablish something about that conversation. And two, that conversation probably isn't what we think it is in terms of them being estranged, because she's not acting like they're estranged. In fact, they talk about having a movie night that night that he dies. So it's unlikely that that was some kind of nuclear fight between them. Instead, it probably was some type of attempt at reconciliation. So good for them for foreshadowing that. But they did it in such an obvious way that somebody that consumes media, that watches movies and television and reads books and plays video games, would pick up on that almost immediately. I don't pretend that I'm special in that regard. I suspect a lot of you could come into the comments and tell me that you picked up on that as well. So it was never a surprise, and that might be one of the reasons why if you go online and you see discussion of that ending of the game, some people it worked for, some people it didn't. I think a lot of us already metabolized that that was the kind of conversation that they had. And so when it happens, you're like, yeah, okay, that lines up with where I thought we were at. And they failed in kind of hiding the ball there. You think Joel died thinking Ellie hates him, and then at the very end of the game, we reveal something different with that last beat. Structuring those flashbacks was a process. Initially, they were all over the place, out of order, and so much of the writing work that Halley was really good at was untangling all of that and simplifying it. So understand what they say up here, that these flashbacks are supposed to be telling you things about what Ellie's coming to realize throughout her story, presumably what Abby is coming to realize throughout her story. And I would argue they probably were that at some point, but in that context, in whatever she's facing in any given situation, they would have been out of order. They wouldn't have been making sense to a lot of players, and I understand needing to streamline it, so I think they probably made the right call, but what they wound up doing was losing that connection to what was happening in the actual present-day narrative to what they were flashing back to. Because if it was originally 2 years ago, then 5 years ago, then 4 years ago, then 1 year ago, and connected with what was happening in the plot, and you changed it all to be oldest to newest, yes, that tells a better flashback story, and I think, again, they made the right call, but you lose that connection with what just happened. And it makes sense for me, who plays this game and is detail-oriented and takes notes, and knew that I was probably going to make a video review of this, that it didn't have that connective tissue. That it played out just like a Lost, or anything else that uses flashbacks or flash forwards or whatever they might be, to tell you an interesting story that relates to what you are learning and gives you greater context, but doesn't inform the character in the moment that they are thinking through these things and reflecting upon them. And without that connective tissue, you don't get any sense of growth. You don't get any sense of Ellie coming to terms with things over the course of this 25-hour adventure, only 14 or 15 of which are hers. You don't get that, and you lose it, and it doesn't make emotional sense anymore. And I think by streamlining it, they lost that connection. Now, here's an interesting question, because they actually say something that is very rare for these kinds of interviews. They tell you that an interpretation is right. The structure you settled on, especially with that very last flashback, makes the game feel like it's the story of Ellie painfully coming to the point where she understands why Joel saved her and is able to forgive him. Gross, I think that's right. Well, now. So, you are implying that what Ellie is struggling with throughout the game is that she wanted to forgive Joel. She has tried to start that process as of the last conversation that they had. And the way that she understands why Joel saved her is to murder hundreds of people, make it safely home, live a family life that Joel could have only dreamed of, go back out, murder another 50 to 60 people, and finally arrive at the object of her vengeance and let her go. Because at that point in time, after doing those things, she understands why Joel saved her. This is a mentally unstable person, which is a fine story to tell, but it's not treated that way. Gross says, I also think it took her 2 years to come to the place where she could even consider embracing forgiveness with Joel. And they tell that story pretty well, that she finds out about the hospital a while before that last conversation, and they are very estranged during that period. At least that's what's implied. So I think they tell that story well. This little bit of language coming up, Ellie's path to forgiving Abby is by far a much harder journey, though. I never for once get the impression that Ellie is forgiving Abby. Ellie, at best, at the end, while drowning Abby and letting go, reflects on the fact that she doesn't just want to be an evil person. She sees Joel's face strumming the banjo, decides that that's not what she wants to be. And it is completely kind of separate from all the rest of the rationalization and all the rest of the logic that you have so far seen her engage with in the game. It's one of the reasons that I think it really felt flat, that they didn't earn that moment. They didn't establish why that would be. Certainly after just having this add-on level where she's in California and has taken these steps to cross another multiple state journey to get here, to then decide not to kill her is very odd. Right. When she says, okay, I am ready for the challenge of forgiving Joel, it's like, no, your challenge is now going to be escalated in a way that could lead to your own destruction and the destruction of the people you love. Which is exactly correct. That's the problem with the revenge story. That's the inherent drama in it, right? Is that you shouldn't be looking to seek revenge. But that's one of the main problems. Nobody in her life delivers this message. Nobody delivers it even afterwards. Even Dina, when she's trying to get her to not go back, to not go to California, doesn't really say all of this. All of this is what we inherently know from lessons like those that we learned in those 80s action movies that Joel and Ellie apparently love. That it is a hollowing experience, that you do risk a lot. You're going to a completely hostile environment with your friends who for some reason are backing you up on this, and it could destroy everything. And Ellie knows that when she gets back from Seattle, and she does it anyway. I don't know what the lesson is here, but it wasn't given in a way that makes sense, at least to me. She travels all the way to Santa Barbara in this IndieWire question just to let Abby live, to save her life even. Abby's decision to heed Lev's caution and spare Ellie is similarly abrupt, but understandable. Were you nervous about selling those key moments? And this is what I think was the question that I really wanted to point at as being potentially problematic, right? If you understand what's being asked here and you watched yesterday's video, or you've otherwise just watched somebody stream the game, you've played it yourself, whatever it might be, two of the big moments that don't make sense are Abby hunting down Ellie, who has killed her friends, who's killed everybody that she loves, getting her to a place where she's about ready to kill Dina, seeing Lev's face and telling her to go home and just leave her. I don't think they properly sold the mental state that Abby was in to get there, to see Lev and to change her mind. I don't think any of that worked. Similarly, actually telling the story where Ellie leaves the farmhouse, leaves Dina, leaves JJ, goes to California on her own, gets all the way there, could have just let her go in her boat, decides not to, decides to fight her to the death, wins, and then lets her go, doesn't make sense. And so IndieWire, despite absolutely being positive, giving that introduction, is essentially suggestive of, hey, were you nervous about selling those key moments? These two particular moments, really, that's a hard land. Do you think you landed them? And then Druckmann doesn't talk about them at all. Well, there are so many emotional parts of the game that for a long time didn't land, and every time it's so daunting to make them work. So often it's just the iterative process of creation and cutting out a bunch of stuff that we realized wasn't necessary. What comes to mind right now is Joel's death. And then he talks a bunch about Joel's death, about how they wanted him to say Sarah at Ellie, which would have been on the nose to no end. And apparently Troy Baker said, hey, bro, I think that's too on the nose, which is something coming from Troy Baker, right? But he was right. Absolutely. And Neil Druckmann admits he was right. You shouldn't say Sarah right there. Absolutely. But he ignores this. Hey, those two things, the people are going to struggle with those. Can you tell us about those moments? Nah, let's talk about Joel's death. Gross then adds, we used to have 5 days in Seattle. I can't even imagine how interminable that game was in the planning process. The 3 days as it is are long, especially when you get to Abby's side of things. Druckmann says there was a whole side story where Ellie went to Seraphite Island, and we had so much to say about the Seraphites and Ellie's journey there, and she's going through like the different layers of hell, and she still keeps going forward. And that's one thing that didn't even make my video yesterday, is that the Scars, the Seraphites, this cult that worships this woman, they really aren't anything but somebody to kill for the wolves, and ultimately for you as you try to get past them. They aren't anything. Lev and Yara's plotline depends on them being something, and the game basically ignores what their framework is, never has you interact directly with them. So you can tell that they're bad. You can tell that they're willing to kill. You can tell from Yara's story that they weren't always that way, but they are now. And it's something useful to shoot in between point A and point B, but you don't get a detailed discussion of what they are. And you don't really get to dive into this whole notion of radical empathy when it comes to the Scars. You mostly just kill them. In fact, Lev has to kill his mother. So maybe people are people, everybody is worth empathy, we should think of them as human beings, but not the Scars. It's very hard to tell what the game is even about because of all this stuff. The flashbacks are moving around. We didn't know this, we didn't know that. And we'll get to the really big one as we continue with this particular interview. Ellie getting revenge on the boar who scared the shit out of her, and also me at the museum. That's why the boar's there. Druckmann. And sometimes it's also about what you add in. The whole idea of putting in a flash of Joel playing guitar while Abby is drowning Ellie, well, for a long time, people were confused why Ellie spares Abby. I can't imagine that that particular problem was alleviated by a quick flash of Joel playing the guitar. I know it wasn't for me. I very much suspect that this will continue to be an item of discussion as to whether or not Druckmann and Gross and The Last of Us Part 2 actually deliver on explaining why Ellie spares Abby in this moment. And he says, well, we were like, what's the right amount where we can just hint at something but not be so explicit that it could only mean this one thing? Now, the cynic in me might suggest a certain amount of J.J. Abrams in that answer. He doesn't actually say what he would like to hint at here, and that's his prerogative in an interview. But a cynic might say they didn't actually want to hint at anything specifically. You just put a frame of Joel in there and people can write their own story. That's good. She sees Joel while she's drowning Abby, and people will figure out what that means. It's all good. Each decision that people make is complex. And it was really the editorial team who was like, what if we did this? We thought it might be hokey, but it worked. Spoiler alert, it is rather hokey. If you haven't actually seen it in action, you're drowning another young woman, and Joel's just there with the banjo, and then Ellie stops. And it's like, oh, okay. Oh, she remembers that vengeance killing is probably not a good idea. Well, it took a long time to get there. Now let's talk about why Ellie goes to Santa Barbara in the first place, and the heartbreaking decision to leave her idyllic life with Dina and the baby. Does she still care about killing Abby at that point, or is it more that she needs absolution from Joel of some kind? Gross, I think those two things are synonymous. Okay, so killing Abby and absolution from Joel are not synonymous to start out with. They are completely different kind of polar opposites of what you might use to motivate this person. But Gross says those are synonymous, and also those are wrong. To my mind, when she's leaving the farm, it almost isn't about Abby at that point so much as it's about, I literally cannot survive if I don't try and handle what's going on because this PTSD is just getting worse. I'm losing control. I feel like I'm at risk to my family, and I have to hope that there's an answer on the other side because I don't know how to live with this. If I stay here, it's suicide. It's more a conversation about mental health and surviving than it is justice for Abby or even seeking Joel. Again, we keep using this term justice for vengeance killings. I got a real issue with this. I'm a little worried about Gross and Druckmann. But note what she is saying here. She is saying it's not about anything, that Ellie is effectively broken. And while I do think that they present the PTSD, she is in as strong a possible of an environment as she could possibly have in the Last of Us world to try to cope with this. Dina is there. JJ is there. Dina is pleading with her, saying that they can fight through it together. They can work through it together. Dina also notably having lost her previous longtime boyfriend in the same fighting and ridiculous cycle of violence action that Ellie caused by going to Seattle in the first place. And not only does she not blame Ellie for that action, she is moving on. Ellie has an exemplar of what moving on looks like. And yes, she has PTSD, and yes, she needs therapy, and yes, there are people there that should be helping her, and I think they are. But just saying, I can't survive this, it's going to be suicide if I stay here, isn't an answer. It's bad storytelling. But it's also not the answer that Druckmann gives. We tried to deconstruct Ellie's relationship with violence versus Joel's relationship with violence. With Joel, it's very practical and pragmatic. 100%. Absolutely true. He doesn't find much pleasure or hatred in killing. He's more indifferent. It's just a function of how he survives. With Ellie, Malcolm Gladwell talks about this. Pause. Malcolm Gladwell is a tremendous writer and a great presenter of interesting stories that are almost always wrong. Or more specifically, they're almost always oversimplified. Right? You might have heard of the 10,000 hour rule that he introduced in his book Outliers. A lot of people talk about becoming an expert at something by spending 10,000 hours on it. It's almost never the case. There's been study after study about this particular claim, and almost without doubt, the people that are more amateurish, that are more middle of the road, practice a ton more than the people that are the true experts, the true savants at whatever the type of thing might be. Malcolm Gladwell does that kind of thing. So when he talks about a culture of honor, when he talks about these things that apparently Neil Druckmann used as the basis for his story, it's a nice idea. It's a nice conceit. Culture of honor is this notion that people born into a specific culture are more worried about wrongs being committed upon them, more worried about people calling them names and things like that. And he says Ellie has this quality. He says her ego is so intertwined with being wrong. I think that's actually being wronged. And she has to make it right. And she believes she can't come to rest until she makes it right. That is not at all the answer that Gross gives. Gross says it's PTSD and I'm mentally unstable and I have to get out of here because my mentality is breaking down. Druckmann says her ego is intertwined with being wrong. She has to go and fight for her honor. These are wildly different answers to one of the most important questions in the actual game. And to have this kind of be the notion that we don't actually understand why our characters are doing this is remarkably telling. And I think comes out in the game itself throughout. And this isn't the only time they do that. Ellie leaves behind the guitar that Joel gives to her. I assume it's not just because Abby chewed off 2 of the fingers. I love this game. Ellie needs to make chords. Well, for me, Gross says, Ellie is putting the idea of Joel to bed. She's burying him respectfully at that point and moving on to a new chapter in her life, whatever that might be. That's a remarkably positive spin on I can't play the chords that remind me of my surrogate father, and so I'm going to relatively sadly place this back next to the chair and walk out into the farm, into the cornfield, and do whatever it is that I'm going to do. Druckmann says, hey, whatever we say here ultimately doesn't matter. Everything you need to understand the story is in the game, and whatever players take from it, their interpretation is right. Another kind of JJ-ism, right? Maybe even Rian Johnson, if you were inclined to think of this as The Last Jedi, where you just say, all right, we're going to do some stuff. It's going to be slightly opaque. We're not going to explain it. Our editors are going to suggest we just flash Joel up there, and hey, whatever you think about it, man, your interpretation is right. This is the worst kind of symptomatic modern storytelling. Whatever you think about it is right. We're not going to go over this. At least until if we ever make another game, and then we can argue about it then. But personally to me, Ellie is finally able to get past her ego. Remember, he was talking about culture of honor and this whole obsession. We'd often use the metaphor of talking about her revenge as a drug. And Ellie is a kind of drug addict, and that's ultimately why Dina left. She's like, the girls hit bottom, and it's still not enough. I can't help her anymore. So we got post-traumatic stress, we got culture of honor, or she's addicted to revenge, which doesn't come across even remotely a little bit. Gross is probably the closest here, saying it's all PTSD and she's mentally unstable. Okay, that's at least a story you could tell. If you want to tell me that your main character is mentally unstable, well, we can go on a whole trip with her because we don't have to think about her logic anymore. She's just mentally unstable. Okay, we can work with that. Druckmann thinks it's culture of honor and, oh, she's addicted to revenge. These are all directions that they could have gone, but they didn't. And it's also the most important lead up here in this interview. Also, I should say that for more than 50% of the production, Ellie used to kill Abby at the end. I'll repeat that. Ellie used to kill Abby at the end. For when this game was built, how we were making it, how we were structuring our story, what we were saying about our characters, why they existed, what conversations they had. The majority of the time we were making this game, Ellie killed Abby at the end, which to me is suggestive of a framework where they don't know what story they are even telling. Because Ellie killing Abby at the end, coming out hollow, losing her fingers, not being able to play Joel's chord, figuring out that vengeance cost her everything in that moment is a story that makes sense. It's not necessarily a story I would tell, and it's not one that I would go back to, but it's a story that makes sense. Her deciding beforehand to do that after losing her fingers and with all the background that we have about what has happened in her journey in this video game doesn't make sense. They like the ambiguity. They like adding the picture of Joel. They like that they have something to reflect on like they had at the end of The Last of Us. Why in the world did Ellie do what she decided to do, but it wasn't earned? Neil Druckmann rightly says that that decision at the end of The Last of Us Part 1 was everything that was already built into Joel's character. So it was earned. And you got there and maybe you were a little bit surprised about the actions that he took. Maybe like me, you disagreed with them, but you still wanted to see the game through to the end. But it was earned. Here they don't have any explanations. They don't even agree on what the explanation might be. And instead, we find out towards the end of this interview that it had a different ending. And not just a different bit of scenes at the end. An actual, honest-to-God, different resolution that winds up telling a different story with different lessons. And they failed to do that. He says that ending where she kills Abby gave a whole different kind of feel. And then another character would have had to have stopped the cycle of violence. But at some point, through our conversations about Yara and Lev, the two Scar kids that Abby helps, we came to the realization that it wasn't as honest to Ellie's character that way. Deep down inside, there's goodness there. Okay, now we have to have a long-form video discussion of Darth Vader and why that's okay in a space opera, a soap opera about familial bonds trying to redeem someone that's murdered hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people with Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, and why it doesn't make sense for someone that goes and seeks out vengeance and just murders indiscriminately. That, yeah, deep down inside, maybe there is goodness there. That doesn't mean it's more honest to Ellie's character to not have her commit that murder because you think that would have been crossing some metaphorical, invisible line. Yeah, she probably should kill Abby there because you haven't told the story well enough to establish why she shouldn't. And in fact, you doubled down when she went to California. The fact that you don't want to make one of your more popular characters into an unmitigated evil is on you and your story. But you did. And just backing off at the end doesn't change the story that you told. Is there any chance she can reconcile with Dina? Well, in spite of all that Ellie's been through, I want her to find love. See, that's crap. Both Abby and Ellie are not protagonists. They're antagonists. They're pretty thoroughly wrong in almost everything that they do throughout this game. And Abby tries to rectify that by helping some people. Ellie doesn't try to rectify that really at all and is given everything on a silver platter and then walks away from it entirely. And that's the kind of thing that should foster judgment. You should be able to look at this story and say, no, she wrecked everything and for what? Nothing. She didn't even have the capacity to kill Abby in the end. And so she got nothing. You shouldn't look at the story of Ellie in this game. If you think this is a good story, you don't get to the end and think, I want her to find love. No, you don't. She did everything in this game to herself, including losing Jesse and Dina, upsetting Tommy, getting Tommy injured, all of these kinds of things. And no, you don't want her to find love. This is the sign of a writer or a director or a studio that is too in love with their character. Yeah, we love this character, so we want them to have a happy ending at the long stage, but we didn't earn that. That's not who this character is. And you have to look at it with crystal clear glasses to really understand that. Then you get to the final question here. Hey, what about part 3? And I'll leave you with this. Druckmann says, hey, now that we've established certain characters and themes and processes, it felt like to justify making a part 2, we had to do something not that fans would just be comfortable with, but do something that would match the emotional core we found in the first game. And unfortunately, if there's one thing I can say about this, Neil Druckmann failed. He didn't find that emotional core that was so present in the first game. That lyricism of a man that has been broken by an apocalyptic event and the loss of his daughter, learning to open up, to warm at least a little bit to this character that has been put in his charge, a character that was written very differently in The Last of Us Part 1 than she was in The Last of Us Part 2 in Ellie, and you didn't find that emotional core. There isn't that emotionality. You don't get those beats, and ambiguity doesn't fill in for those beats. So I think this interview is very important. I think it's very enlightening. I highly recommend you check out the rest of it if you are at all interested, because this is the kind of interview that we don't see in this medium very often, and we don't really see in any medium very often, where you actually have a director and writer answering these questions in a way that not only is enlightening, but is also remarkably unhelpful in terms of actually getting the answers to the questions that you want, as you see these two people charged with the narrative disagreeing on the simplest of elements, or otherwise ignoring the question altogether. Thank you very much for checking this postmortem out. If you're interested in this, we did do that postmortem earlier on the overall game where we gave our review for the first 15 minutes and talked about spoiler issues with the narrative in the last 45. Check that out. Otherwise, we're talking about video games, movies, television, and a whole lot of law and business in this space on the Hoeg Law YouTube channel. Thanks again.